How are you today?
I am good. How? Hey everybody, how's it going? Today is Thursday, December 3rd. We are almost through another week of this and getting closer and closer to winter break. Well, if you are watching this, you weren't in class today, and that's okay. Hope you are well. Hope those around you are well, and hope you're finding some time to get some normal in this pandemic world that we're living in. So, a couple things today. First of all, the goal of today is to wrap up our unit on Manifest Destiny in the West, and so we have 2 slides left to look at. And then you can use the rest of your time you have allotted for American history to hopefully wrap up your work on the U.S. versus the Sioux tribe, because that's due tomorrow. Also, make sure your notes are in order because tomorrow is test day. Come into class, we'll do trivia at the beginning, and then I'm going to share out a Google form test, and you're going to rock it. All right, so here we go. Here's the things that we talked about today. First of all, reminder, and I just said this test is tomorrow. It's going to have some true and false questions. It's going to have some multiple choice questions, and there's going to be one short essay. The last one we did was all writing. This one's going to be a little bit more, there's going to be some button clicking for multiple choice and stuff this time, okay? Don't forget that you have an assignment due tomorrow by midnight. That's the U.S. versus the Sioux tribe. There's 2 little things in there. There's a map sheet about Wounded Knee, and then there's a small excerpt or piece from Black Elk Speaks and some questions that went along with that. Now today what we're going to do is we're going to discuss what happened to the tribes. Once the tribes gave up, what was next? And then we're going to talk about what people did for work in the West. Once Manifest Destiny became a thing, what was it that people did to make money out there? And again, take some work time, work on U.S. versus Sioux tribe. And please, as always, if you have any questions, please let me know. All right, so here we go. Here's our stuff. So this slide's called The End of Indian Independence because this really kind of, once the Sioux are defeated at the massacre that happens at Wounded Knee, you really see just a mass end to any resistance to what the United States government and United States Army was doing. And so a lot of tribes got put on reservation lands. Now, a lot of those reservation lands were in Indian territory, or what is present-day Oklahoma, but there were reservations all over. I mean, we have a lot of reservations. Well, not a lot. I think it's 11 reservations up in northern, mostly in northern Wisconsin, but throughout Wisconsin. Those reservations obviously were small. They were more restrictive than native tribes used to have the freedom to move in large tracts of land. Oftentimes, too, those reservations were land that was not necessarily desirable to white people or settlers for any reason. It wasn't the best farmland. It wasn't great for ranching. There wasn't necessarily a bunch of animals there that you could hunt and eat. And so reservation life was, I guess the best term I could use is restrictive. It was way more restrictive in what and where the tribes could do things. Although it was restrictive in the beginning, many of the tribes still attempted to live communally as large groups as they had, or in bands as they had on their lands. They tried to keep a number of their traditions alive, religious ceremonies, languages, even the types of structures that they lived in the beginning, until there were changes made that we'll talk about later in the slide. One big difference was the United States opened a number of Indian academies, or Indian schools, in the eastern part of the country. And what happened was they went into the tribal lands and removed the children. They took the kids away from the tribes and took them to these schools where they basically taught them to be not native. They cut the boys' hair. They made the boys and girls dress in more traditional American clothing. They ate American foods. They were taught to speak English and read and write in English. They were punished for doing things in their old cultural ways or speaking in their old languages. And so the idea of these schools was to educate, but it was really more to Americanize and assimilate. Now, assimilate means to make something part of another group, to by force or by choice. Now, the idea being that when these kids were done with school, they wouldn't want to go back to their familial lands. They wouldn't want to go back to the reservation, and even if they did, they wouldn't be able to relate to the religion. They wouldn't be able to speak the language, and they wouldn't be able to, they wouldn't want to partake in in life the way it was. The schools were often very abusive in how they treated kids. Kids that resisted were physically harmed. The girls, I read this article one time about girls were forced to wash their hair with steel wool because they were told that they were dirty and full of bugs. And so a lot of times the behavior, it was more than just a school to teach someone to be an American, but it was also just kind of a cruel way to assimilate someone into the culture. So a number of those kids did not go back, or when they did, they didn't fit onto the reservation lands. Meanwhile, on the reservation lands, the government passed something called the Dawes Severalty Act. Now, whether or not the government thought they were helping or whether they thought that this was just another step towards Americanizing, it can be kind of unclear. But what they did was they said, okay, you guys are still trying to live in these teepees and you're still trying to, live in this communal way. But what we think would be better is if you broke up into individual family units and you had your own land that belonged to you and your family. And so they passed this thing called the Dawes Severalty Act, where each family was given a certain amount of acreage on the reservation, and it was basically promoted that they become farmers. If they farmed the land that they were given, if they built a home on that land and they farmed it and kept it for 25 years, that land became theirs forever, and they became U.S. citizens and eventually were then given the right to vote. So it was kind of like farming for citizenship. I hate to make it sound like a game show, but it was again forcing more American culture. So you were taking some people who maybe their tribe were mostly hunter-gatherers, and you're going, no, that's not how you're going to do things. You're going to farm. Now, on these reservations, schools were built, churches were built. Different people kept track of things on those lands. But again, it was more of a step towards Americanization and forced Americanization. Now, obviously, our unit ends in like 1900 or so. But that injustice has continued on into modern times. Native American men and women were not given the right to vote until 1924. They're actually, I believe, the last group of people in the United States to be allowed to legally vote. Native children could still be removed for foster care and put up for forced adoptions into the 1970s. So that means that you have people who are like a little bit older than me, who were potentially taken away from their native family because a white family wanted a child. Okay. Again, and this is an attempt to break down the native culture and Americanize the people. But you imagine, I can't imagine. I was born in 1974. I can't imagine when I was born, if I had been born to a native family and someone would have come into the hospital and gone, well, a white family wants a kid, so here we're gonna snatch this kid and we're gonna give him to this white family. And my parents had no say in it. Okay. Now, if you don't believe me on this one, it is a thing. You can read about it, forced adoptions into the 1970s, where babies were taken away from their families. A lot of times the native children that were put in foster care were sterilized. Now, if you don't know what that means they went through a chemical process to make sure or a surgical process to make sure that they couldn't have children, thus trying to end Native American bloodlines because, well, if you can't have kids, you're not going to be able to pass on the Native American, culture, race, things like that. And if you think about this, if you put those things together, okay, you're going down a really, really negative path. You're going down a path that people don't easily forgive, that people don't forget. And that's why Native American tribes today are still very skeptical of the U.S. government, because a lot of the people who went through this are still alive. They're slightly older than me. They're grandparent age, and they were taken from their families, or, they knew people that were sterilized because they were Native American. Obviously, too, over the years, there have been numbers of treaties that have been broken where promises were made to tribes that haven't been followed through on. Some presidential administrations are better to tribal governments than they are to, others are. It'll be interesting to see how when President-elect Biden takes over from Trump, what steps are taken in Native American with Native American tribes, with the First Nations. And honestly, some tribes are considered to be like they're their own governments. They're their own countries. And some of those tribes have been terminated as being official tribal nations. Now, when a tribe is terminated as official tribal nation, their treaties become null and void. Any funding or things they had coming from the federal government, those become nothing. And those people basically don't have the rights that they were promised in initial treaties. Um, you know, if you've ever been to a native reservation, the ones in Wisconsin are very nice comparatively to some of the other ones that I've been in other parts of the country. I've been out to places in Montana where I've visited people on reservations where the poverty levels are really high, life expectancy rates are really low, alcoholism rates, domestic violence rates are through the roof, and obviously one of the deciding factors in that is the poverty rate, lack of jobs. And it's really a sad situation that you can date back to the Manifest Destiny era. Before we move on to the last topic, I wanted to give you some proof about this adoption stuff. And so this is a letter dated April 25th, 1952. And it says, "Dear Mr. and Mrs. Seeley, thank you very kindly for your donation of $10 from my little Indians. You're the first yours is the first invitation that was ever extended to one of the papooses." That's a really not okay word. That's like the N word. That's like, yeah, that's not okay. To come and spend a vacation somewhere. We have a few little boys and girls who have no one at all interested, whether they live or die or come and go. I would send a little boy of 6 years or older or a little girl, whatever you prefer. These Indian children are very little trouble, especially the one I have in mind. If you really mean it, I will see that we get him ready. You may have him anytime you desire. I am not making any inquiries about you because it takes a good person to make an offer as you did. Please let me know. With best regards, and then a signature. So think about that. That means that they're trading a Native American kid for $10. They did no background check. When they say that no one cares about them, that's not really true. But this is basically selling a child for $10. Is it slavery? Is it adoption? Is it forced adoption? Well, I'll let you decide on that one. You're all very, very smart. All right, the last slide that we're going to look at is on how people made money in the West. And the economy of the West can basically be broken into like 3 or 4 things. But first, I want to talk about women's role in the West. And that is that women were often viewed very equally in the West. They were viewed as powerful people. And the reason for that is because if you were a woman and you were traveling west with your family, when you got to your land, you had to work just as hard to establish the home and just as hard to establish the farm and just as hard to, keep things going as the men in your family did. And therefore, women were seen very much as partners in what was going on in the West. All right. A lot of women who settled in towns took part in what's called the oldest profession. They became prostitutes. Now, before you're like, oh, ew, gross, yuck, whatever, prostitution was legal. I'm not saying it's a preferred career path, but it was legal, and it was a way for young women to make money. A lot of times, those women were not prostitutes forever. They did it long enough to make money to start a business, start a school, buy the saloon that they worked in. And so women often became powerful people within the towns they lived in because so much money was flowing in and out of their hands. Now, when you put these two things together, when you put together the equality and the monetary power, in the West, women were extended the right to vote much earlier than they were in other parts of the country. Okay. Now, as far as men went, there were generally 3 jobs that men tended to do in the West. One was mining. Mining for gold, silver, quartz, different obviously precious metals. Obviously, it was a tough way to make a living. Not a lot of people made money. I mean, not everybody was finding a chunk of gold. Not everybody was finding, silver, quartz, diamonds, things like that. As a matter of fact, most of the people that made money in the mining business weren't miners at all. There were people like Levi Strauss, who was a wholesaler, sold tents, he sold shovels, he sold pickaxes, but more famously, he is one of the people that invents a more durable pair of pants for living in, working in, and the rivets and the zipper system that goes along with it. Levi Strauss helps invent the first pairs of jeans, denim pants. Now, the thing is, when gold or silver, let's say gold was found outside of Marshall, and there was nothing here. What happened is a large number of people would come to that area. They would move into that area very quickly, and what would start off as a tent town would soon develop into what was called a boom town. Boom town because the population explodes overnight. You would have saloons, you would have hotels, you had the sheriff's office in some places. Some had churches. Mostly it was just saloons, hotels, places that you could have your minerals tested to see if they were valuable. A lot of times, though, there was not a lot of justice in those towns. The average age, they were mostly male. The average age was pretty young because people that were mining for gold were on average like 18, 19 years old. You would go out and mine all day, and if you found something, you'd come and cash it in. You'd play cards, you'd drink. There'd be the prostitution going on in the upstairs of the saloons, and so there was a need for law. Some towns had justice systems. They had sheriffs, they had deputies. There's a famous family called the Earps, E-A-R-P, Wyatt Earp being the sheriff. The thing that a lot of people don't realize about like the Earp family is not only were they the sheriffs, but they also got a cut of all the prostitution, gambling, and alcohol sold in the towns that they worked in. But a lot of times vigilante justice took over. A vigilante is somebody who takes the law into their own hands. They act as judge, jury, and executioner. Even though he wasn't an executioner, I think maybe the best example could be Batman, not actually a cop, but fought crime on his own. And so if vigilantes believed that I did something, there was no trial. They chased me down and they would punish me accordingly. And a lot of times the punishment was death. And they would hang people, they would shoot them, they would draw and quarter them, tarring and feathering. They buried people in the desert up to their neck, and birds would pick at your eyes and things like that. And so vigilante justice systems were in place for quite a while in these cities. Now, eventually, the prostitutes age out of the job. They get too much money. Eventually, the 18-year-old miner becomes a 26 and 27-year-old man. They don't want to do the things they're doing anymore, and so they marry, they have kids, they build a home, white picket fence, there's a school in the town, the saloons become a little less crazy, one turns into a restaurant, and you have towns. Like the boom town becomes a town that a town that you recognize. Reno, Nevada, for instance. Boulder, Colorado. Eventually, Las Vegas is even a boom town. Okay. A lot of people in the West cattle ranched. Obviously, there was a need for beef in the East. There were Texas Longhorns that roamed the Texas-Oklahoma area freely. Ranchers would go and round them up and brand them with their particular logo. They would have vaqueros or cowboys round them up and take them to cattle towns. And cattle towns were auction houses. They would be bought by people. They would be loaded on trains, taken to Chicago. Chicago was the slaughterhouse capital of the world. They process the meat, turn it into hamburger, turn it into steaks, load it on train cars, and take them to the people that want those things. There was a lot of money to be had in cattle ranching. A lot of those original cowboys were farmhands. They weren't running around shooting people to keep the law of justice. They were Latino. They were Black. They were immigrants. Yes, there were white cowboys, but not as many as TV and movies would lead you to believe. Cattle ranching often came into conflict with farming because the cattle ranchers would allow their cattle to roam onto lands and break down the lands and then destroy the crops. And then there were some arguments between those things. You had what were called range wars, or arguments over who could use the land. Probably the most common way that people made money in the West was through farming. Two things that really helped farmers be successful were, first of all, the Homestead Act. The Homestead Act allowed people for a very small fee to be able to buy up to, like, it was 160 acres of land for a filing fee. And so you got to go out and claim land for a very, very low amount of money, and that land was yours, and you got to have it, and you could farm it forever and ever and ever. Then there were several inventions that helped out the farmer. Barbed wire was invented by Joseph Glidden and helped keep cattle and wildlife out of your fields. John Deere from Vermont moves to Illinois and becomes famous for making a steel plow, which is more durable. Someone invents a twine binder that cuts things and wraps them up. You start to get early versions of tractors and combines, and life becomes a little simpler for farmers in general. Okay. Now, one really big problem they had was lack of water. And so that was a big struggle, but eventually the farmers of the Midwest realized that they're over an aquifer. An aquifer is an underground like water source or pockets of water all under the Midwest. And so they decide that they're going to drill down. They insert pipes in the ground and they use windmills to pump. You see the hand pumps. Windmills are more efficient. They use windmills to pump water out of the ground, and they're able to use that to irrigate their crops. And the area that we talked about at the beginning of the chapter that was called the Great American Desert becomes known as the breadbasket of America because we start to produce so much crop. Now, we've looked at a lot of different topics in this chapter. We've talked about manifest destiny. We've talked about the Great Plains. We've talked about how Latinos lost their land. We've talked about what happened to tribes. We've talked about the Transcontinental Railroad. We talked about what people do for a living in the West. Tomorrow's test will be true and false, multiple choice, and a short essay. The short essay will deal with manifest destiny. I promise that. Okay. So if you have any questions about the unit, please feel free to let me know, and I will answer them for you and make sure you're ready to go tomorrow. Again, hope you're well. Reach out if you need help. Bye-bye.